Welcome to the Wholehearted Eating Podcast, where non-diet nutrition, weight-inclusive care, and integrative health collide. We're your hosts, Dana Montes and Christina Hoyt, licensed integrative clinical nutritionists and body image coaches.
And we believe you deserve to have a joyful relationship with food in your body, even if you have a chronic health condition or symptoms that just won't quit. On this show, together and with our guests, we're bringing the real talk, no BS vibe with tangible tools to help you pursue health and wellness without obsession or restriction.
Remember our disclaimer, this podcast is meant for general information purposes only and should not be taken as a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
All right, great. I am so excited to have Dr. Jennie Wang-Hall on today to talk about eating disorders and interfamily systems, and more like, you might have heard it more like the more casual term would be parts work and stuff like that. And so I'm so excited to have you on. So Jennie, will you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of like what type of work you do and how you got into this type of work?
Yes, absolutely. So, as Christina said, I'm Jennie Wang-Hall and I'm a psychologist. I'm a counseling psychologist specializing in eating disorders. So I've been working in eating disorders since 2011, which makes me feel like kind of ancient, but I've been, working in all levels of care. So started working in residential and then have worked in like inpatient PHPs, IOPs. And for the last about 5 years, I've been, in my own private practice in outpatient. And so I'm really passionate about working with eating disorders. I feel like my passion for eating disorder work is informed by my lived and living experience, as well as the clinical training that I've done, and just really kind of seeing the depth and the courage of the hearts of folks with eating disorders, and the way in which like people with eating disorders are so often dedicated to healing and loving and living in a way that very few people are. So I just find the work very exciting. So I do individual therapy as well as supervision and consultation. I also run a group in my practice for providers with eating disorders. So I do kind of a wide range of different things within my private practice. And then I also have a social media platform where I do just different types of education about things really in the eating disorder field. So I have my hands kind of in a lot of different pots, and I really, really love this work. I think another lens that's important that shows up in my social media and in my clinical work is just around social justice and how central social justice really is to the process of healing from an eating disorder. Because I think so often, and we'll get into this with talking about parts work, but so often we look at an eating disorder and we say, hey, we healed this, we did this, we're challenging these behaviors, but then 6 months later, we see that somebody's struggling again. Somebody is stuck in a certain behavior or circumstance. And maybe what we haven't taken into consideration is some of the bigger systemic pieces that might really be informing somebody's experience. And so social justice is a really important lens that I think all of us should be bringing to our work, and something that I'm really passionate about. So I'm sure that will show up today.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think, well, one, that's something that we're really passionate about too. And we've had people coming on and talking about it more and more. And I think it's wonderful that that is something that you're passionate about, and how integral it is as part of the eating disorder conversation and the healing portions of eating disorders, which I think is sometimes we think of eating disorders as very much like a one note type of thing, and which is a huge misconception, widely misunderstood. And one of the reasons why I got really excited about having you come on was because of a post that you did about parts work and how important parts work is in part of healing with an eating disorder. And so I'd love for you to share a little bit about what is parts work specifically, and how does it maybe play a role in eating disorder healing in your mind?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I love this. And I think, when I'm thinking about parts work, oftentimes I'm kind of conceptualizing this from an attachment-based framework and thinking about, based on the different lived experiences that we've had, whether it be attachment wounding or some type of trauma, or living with a certain marginalized identity, we over time inevitably are going to develop different components of ourselves that serve functions to keep us safe, that serve functions to really help us stay grounded, operate in the world, survive in ways that we have to, whether that be surviving and thriving or surviving in a really scary circumstance that we really just have to kind of get through. So over time, based on our diverse array of life experiences, we develop these different internal components that are going to act in different ways in different situations. And I think, IFS uses different language for different types of parts, which I think for some folks is super helpful. But a post that I had recently done was around like all the things that my eating disorder personally protected me from. And so the language of protection feels really true to me. And I think a lot of folks really resonate with that. So if we think about the eating disorder as like a protector part, what we really need to be thinking about is like, first and foremost, gratitude for that protector because it developed for such an important reason. We needed that safety. We needed that ability to survive, that ability to feel, safe in whatever way. A therapist or a doctor or somebody else might look at you and be like, well, an eating disorder is not a good way to do that. But the reality is that eating disorders actually help us in a lot of ways. They are harmful, obviously, in many ways too. But I just think it's really important to validate and honor the importance of that part, how it has shown up for you, to also then get really curious about like the eating disorder has been protecting you for so long. What else could protect you? What other parts might exist internally, or how might we work with a part to help it understand that its role can shift? That maybe the goal is not about the eating disorder part going away, but shifting roles or learning something new. So I think, thinking through the ways that the eating disorder is protective is crucial, and that's more, I would say, than like, what is the function of the eating disorder? Because your relationship with your eating disorder is intimate. It's private. It's for many people really sacred. So how do we like meet that in a really relational space like we would any other relationship we care about?
Yeah, I really love that approach because I think in a lot of ways it's in such conflict with a lot of the more broader narratives that we hear, especially in more residential type treatments and more broadly used treatments that we hear about. A lot of times, a lot of my clients will come to me and saying like, well, I need to squash my eating disorder voice and I need to strengthen my recovery voice and all those things, which yes, but to me, it feels like it's really unique when I come to them and I'll say, because I bring parts work into the nutritional work that I do with them, and I'll say like, well, wait a minute. This is not bad. There's no part of you that's bad that we need to quiet down and suppress down. Maybe this part really has something to say. Maybe it's been trying to do something for a really long time. And I think there is something when you start to bring that in, it can be a really beautiful place because for a long time, the individual who's been dealing with this has been trying so hard to ignore it. And it's like almost like the more you try to ignore it, especially when they come to me, I always say like the nutritionist is like the best friend that you hate during treatment, right? Because it's like the direct violation of everything your eating disorder wants you to do. And here I am saying, all right, guys, we're going to put food to mouth. And they're like, no, like everything comes up during that. And so if I can say like, hey, wait a minute, pause. You're a part of you is really reacting strongly to this. Let's talk about it. What does this part feeling? What's coming up for you? All of those things. And so I think my question for you is, where was that bred for you in relating to parts work as part of eating disorder treatment when you came from a residential type of background? What was that like for you and how did that transition happen?
Yeah, I think basically what I've spoken about in other contexts is the way that working in various different treatment facilities and different levels of care really gave me exposure to a lot of different modalities, a lot of different approaches to therapy. And over time, I was kind of able to see like, here's what really works well. Here's what doesn't work. These things feel true to who I am as a practitioner. These things don't. And I think what I really kind of came to over the course of, the last 13 years is basically that I am a relational human in a way that is undeniable. I cannot I cannot sit down with a worksheet and take somebody through it or show them a diagram and like talk about how that relates to their eating disorder. That's just not personally who I am or how I practice. So kind of what was making sense to me more and more over the course of my clinical career has been utilizing the relationship as this really special container, this vessel for healing work, and honoring the wisdom of my client in terms of like, today they want to think about these thoughts that have been going through their mind all week. Today they want to dive into the emotions and the real fear around releasing the eating disorder, like honoring where it is that my client actually wants to go. But always bringing the lens of like, who are you? Who am I? What's showing up between us? What's showing up in you that isn't happening right here? It isn't happening between us. It's been happening for you since you were a child. You learned it from a young age, from attachment figures. And I think the more that I've kind of done, the more that I've done this very relational work, I've seen that the relationships that I'm navigating with my client are decades old at times. The attachment dynamics, the experiences they have of themselves, of whether to trust themselves or trust other people, come from so long ago. So taking that relational lens means attuning to all of the attachment figures and experiences that they've had throughout their entire life. And that lends itself very naturally to parts work, because we need to be able to say, this component developed when you were 7 after that experience. And let's look at the roles it's played since then. Let's look at the attachment needs that have been met for you by that part. Because we can't just look at my relationship with you is really healthy. Okay, that's not enough. Like, if that were enough, that would be awesome and super easy because I'm good at having healthy relationships. But like, that's not what healing really is. It's so much more complex than that.
Yeah, well, I think that's really interesting too, what you mentioned about how the attachment plays a role in how the eating disorder kind of shows up and what exactly is it supporting. And I'd love for you to dive a little bit more into that attachment part, if you don't mind.
Yes, absolutely. So, my dissertation and all of my doctoral research is in attachment. So attachment theory and attachment orientation is kind of my background that I have used as a lens for getting into eating disorder work. So basically, I think that for folks who, had really dismissive or invalidating or, neglectful, avoidant parents, oftentimes we see the development of this attachment anxiety wherein folks feel like, you're going to leave me. These relationships, this, connection is not stable. It's not safe. I have to do X, Y, or Z to earn approval, to earn safety, to earn like worthiness, honestly. So for folks who've had this particular constellation of parental, oftentimes experiences, the attachment anxiety is really natural and it's going to stick with them for a long time. And kind of what that lends itself to within an eating disorder is that somebody who has a lot of attachment anxiety, who relationally really is not able to get their needs met, can get a lot of needs met through the eating disorder, which is very clear about here's what it means to be good. Here's what it means to be bad. Here's how you're worthy. Here's how you're unworthy. The rules are like, all things considered, I mean, it's very complex in many ways, but the rules are often very simple. Yeah. Like it's numbers, it's metrics, it's behaviors, like, the things to check off the list.
There's a lot of things that are very controllable and manageable that you can monitor, things that you can check off, things that you can make sure that you're accomplishing. I mean, it's like the with the attachment stuff, with the way you're talking about it with the worthiness, it's an immediate breeding ground for control, perfectionism, all of those things that would come up that we see so often in eating disorders that I think people are like, oh, why are you trying to be perfect all the time? Or like, why does this mean so much to you? It's like, well, it's because there's like a 5-year-old in me who learned this at a very young age that here's how we manage this. And then this eating disorder kind of came as it, for lack of a better word, like this protective part that you were kind of alluding to and talking about. And so I'm curious of like, in so many ways, what I'm hearing from you is that you're kind of explaining that our eating disorders are protecting us from a lot of things. And the more we get to know that eating disorder, the more we get to understand, in my language, what I say is like under the hood, like what's underneath it?
Yeah.
Like, what is it? Like, what is underneath all of this that is going to explain where all this came from? So I'd love for you to share, like, what do you feel like the eating disorders are protecting us from exactly?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is such a multi-layered exploration. And I just really love having these conversations with folks, with clinicians, with clients, because I think it's really central to our understandings of ourselves as clinicians and the work we do, and for us to really be able to meet our clients intimately and validation and care. And so I think, one of the things that I see most often, kind of like what we're speaking about already, is the attachment wounding. I think that eating disorders really, really protect folks from the depths and the intensity of attachment wounding that they may have already experienced or that they fear experiencing again in the future. Because when you know how to make yourself good or bad, when you have a very clear set of rules and things, like you said, that are in your control, that protects you from the uncertainty, the variability, maybe the dismissal, invalidation, or maybe even abuse of other people, either currently or historically. So the eating disorder is such a safe place in a world relationally that may feel very unsafe. And so, when I see folks who are coming from really abusive households or having dynamics in a partnership that are really unhealthy or just unsustainable, and they have an eating disorder that's like serving all these functions for them, I'm like, oh my goodness, thankfully you developed this eating disorder that kept you safe and gave you a sense of security that then somehow, which will track it forward, landed you on my couch, on my screen, whatever it might be, to do this work. Like, your eating disorder kept you safe until this point where you realized that it's time for something else to protect you, that maybe it's time for you to protect you. So I think a lot about attachment wounding. I also think about, kind of what we were chatting about earlier, just like the systemic pieces and like attachment. We're talking about a microsystem, but I don't think we can treat eating disorders in an apolitical lens, because when you develop an eating disorder, you're in the context of white supremacy. You're in the context of capitalism and patriarchy and ableism. And when folks, either with or without marginalized identities, are operating under these systems, the oppression is crushing. It's so heavy. It's so intense that eating disorders give us a sense of what is right and what is wrong. They oftentimes purchase us social capital, living in a thin body. For folks who have more restrictive eating disorders who do result in a thin body, purchases you a lot of freedom and a lot of privilege. And of course, that's not true for everybody who has eating disorders. And there is a hierarchy within eating disorders of, like restrictive, anorexic, thin, above and beyond other types of eating disorders. But yeah, I just think that the eating disorder helps us survive both micro and macro systems that are really untenable.
Yeah, I think that honestly, what I was thinking about as you were talking about in a way, how the eating disorder has served such a loving purpose, in a way, like a destructive but loving purpose, right?
Right.
It's kind of interesting because I think in a lot of ways, for people who might be hearing this maybe for the first time, this could be so validating, right? Like, and thinking like, wow, that is right. It was protecting me from stigma and discrimination outside of my home too. It is protecting me from those things. And I think that's also part of the realities of when you're doing this work and you're finally at the place where, okay, I don't want my eating disorder to be doing this job anymore. And I want to utilize other parts of me, my more adult self, like resourced self, to be able to help and to be able to manage those, what I usually refer to as my big feels. I have two young kids. I'm like, we got big feels, they're there. It's happening. This is what it is. And I also have big feels, and everyone does have big feels too. And I think it's really interesting to me to think about, how do we honor the fact that our eating disorder has provided us that care during that time. And also at the same time, not glorify that like, oh, well, it's serving a purpose. Great, cool. I'm going to just keep going, even though it is actually quite destructive. But at the same time, living within the system that we live in, no wonder we are having a hard time letting go of it because the system isn't changing. The system is still doing what it's doing. And now we're telling this part, hey, I don't want you doing this anymore, but I also can't protect you.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And I think,
It's like, whoa.
yeah, it's such a huge conundrum that folks come up against when, like you said, they are ready to, like, I'm ready to recover, or I'm ready to live with more safety and healing, like whatever the languages they choose. But yeah, the world is not shifting. And I think during this time in particular, with the world global context that we're operating in, it is easy to not have hope, to not be able to find any hope. And when you're looking at just the wide array of global disasters that are happening, we have to kind of be real about the fact that people are discouraged. People don't see a reason to keep pushing, fighting, treating themselves better when the world isn't going to treat them better, when things around them are total dumpster fire. So I think, what's really, really tough is helping people find hope to counter these systems of oppression means finding ways to mobilize towards action. And so when we think about it, like if I'm working with a client who maybe has identities of marginalization, is also particularly impacted by the global theater of what's happening, in terms of, just quality of life, and they're have been experiencing maybe a long-term eating disorder, there's so many levels. So the first level is going to be like, on an eating disorder basis, what shifts would make you feel hopeful that you can do something different? Like what micro shifts, even maybe harm reduction strategies, are going to make you feel like you can be safer, you can be stronger and more stable. Then we think about like sort of the more identity related component, which is like, how do I build community? How do I build like that internal attachment based resourcing to feel like I have a standing chance of surviving in this world with these identities? And then the bigger picture of the broad systems that we operate in, thinking about, where is my role? Where can I take action? Can I participate in mutual aid? Can I barter with somebody to provide a service that's needed? Can I go to a protest? Can I boycott something? In what ways can I mobilize towards global action? And for so many folks, increasingly in the social justice context that we're seeing, that is a part of the recovery process.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting too and then also I think in part, bringing in that hope when you feel like things are not really going in the way that you want, even with mobilization. I think that is something too, especially I feel like maybe this is coming off the heels of the fact that I just watched the Oprah special, Making the Shift. And I don't know if you've seen it, but we're doing a talk about it on the podcast later this summer so people can listen to it and what about it too. But it was interesting. One of the things that came up for me during it is with the rise of things like these medications and stuff like that, and the way that they're talking, the industry is now talking about weight stigma and talking to you. It's like, it almost feels like in a way they're like mobilizing you by making you part of this. And it's really, to me, it could feel like it's hard because they do talk very specifically about the stigma, but the answer is really convoluted and obviously very capitalistic and proliferating of pharmaceuticals and things like that. It's a major problem. But I'm curious too of like, where do you find that push-pull for a client where does harm reduction start for you? And where do you decide? I think one of the things that I think I'm having a hard time like articulating this, but I think one of the things that I always hear a lot of times in the world is this idea of like, well, they decided that they're recovered enough. And I think like, to me, I feel like, okay, if we have one moment and one piece of this entire journey with this person and and like the person who's going through it or someone who's listening, who's dealing with an eating disorder is going through this with their whole lives. What is like the first step in this parts work and this mobilization and identifying these systems that are bringing them down, like diet culture and the patriarchy and white supremacy and all of the things that play such a big role that we all notice and feel and see every day of our lives and has directly informed the way we move through the world. I'm curious of like where you would say for someone to meet themselves for the first time with their eating disorder as this protective part and saying, okay, I see you. Here's what we're up against.
Yeah. I mean, such a huge journey for somebody to embark upon. So like, absolutely, I think many different points of entry. But I do think that for folks to kind of, if you're at a point where you recognize you have an eating disorder, you want things to shift, or it feels untenable, scary, dangerous, even if you're not ready for things to shift. I think the question from a parts work perspective is like, what are the unmet needs? And you can ask yourself what the unmet needs are without knowing how old the part is, without knowing where the part came from, without knowing who the part, might have been responding to. But if you just look at yourself and you say, eating disorder aside, what are my unmet needs? Maybe I have an unmet need for stability. Maybe I have an unmet need for a validation or recognition. Maybe I have an unmet need for mastery or competence. There's so many different things that might show up for folks with eating disorders. And I think then the exploration from a parts work perspective can be historical and can look at ways in which the attachment system did not meet those needs. And then, so we're talking about micro and macro again, because here's the macro level of, I am not a valid, for me being a mixed race person, although I have white passing privilege, I am not completely valid in the system of white supremacy. Being, a cis woman, I have privilege above those who are not cisgender, but I also don't have privilege or don't have, dominance in the system of patriarchy, of misogyny. So whatever it might be, I think asking yourself, what are my unmet needs and what are the systems then that are keeping me under-resourced? And then I think the exploration is around mobilization, community building. What does it look like on that macro level for me to start getting my needs met in a system that may not shift much, at least in our lifetimes, in ways that would be as satisfying as we would really hope for?
Yeah. And also feels like it's going back in time in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah,
and I could see how in the current political climate in the US, people could feel like their eating disorder is really, really protective right now because it is a place and one of the only places where they feel like they actually can have control over their own individual body as well, which I think is something that we can kind of forget and not realize that this is all part of all of these things as well. And I think that kind of leads me to this other Instagram post that you said about how recovery is your choice. And I'm wondering too, is it in some ways, yes. And I love doing that with everybody, like a little yes and situation. But I am wondering there are parts of your recovery that are your choice, but there are other parts of your recovery that you're still living underneath the lens. And so I'd love for you to talk about the access to underneath that lens and what that looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think the first kind of foundational, I guess, part of my framework around that is that my client is going to tell me what parts are their choice and what parts aren't their choice. That is never my determination. I never get to look at somebody and say, well, you don't have a choice about living under white supremacy, but you do have a choice as to whether or not you do X, Y, or Z, or you do have a choice about this and that, because that's not my place. I don't engage in any kind of power posturing where I'm making determinations or verdicts about my client's experience. So ultimately, what they decide is and isn't their choice is the paradigm that we're going to operate in. That being said, I think that we we have intuition and we have agency around the direction that we want to move in our healing work. And the systems that happens in are not our choice. So I may feel really, really pulled towards liberation. I may feel really pulled towards wanting to experience personal freedom from my eating disorder. And I might even be really motivated to create change around that. But the fact that, I'm living in X, Y, or Z type of body, let's say that you're a person living in a larger body who is in the culture of Ozempic, that person doesn't have a choice but to see that on TV and to meet somebody down the street who's on Ozempic right now. Like those are things that are in their atmosphere, whether or not they choose for it to be. So I just think that yes, we do all have agency and choice, and that choice occurs within the context of these broader systems. So often what I really love doing with folks is helping them decide okay, what aspects do I actually have agency over? Like what parts of my life, my body, my world, my identity are up to me? And or how can I shift in a way that gives me more agency and control? But yeah, it's such a vastly complex question. And I think that it's a really hard and messy exploration that I don't have all the answers to,
Yeah.
I love figuring it out alongside my clients.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point too. That it is messy and it is complicated. And I think that's where, for me, I think one of the biggest things for when doing eating disorder work is about helping the individual decide and to create their own agency and autonomy. And what does autonomy mean to them? And in some ways, I've been thinking a lot about it, more about my own sovereignty over myself, right? And how do you want to govern yourself in the world in which we live in, right? With the access to the things that we have access to and the things that we don't have access to and the things that we can control, the things that we can't control. And I think one of the things that comes up a lot for me is, what do I have influence over versus what do I don't have influence over of myself, not necessarily of my clients, but of yourself. Right. When you're going down this journey. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about the idea of resourcing from an IFS lens. What do we have access to, and how does our access shift how our recovery could look?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for so many folks, this sort of exploration around resourcing occurs on the dual levels of the micro attachment system, particularly taking a historical lens, and the more macro system. Because we can think about concrete resourcing, but also white supremacy doesn't resource us in ways that collective liberation and community building do. So I think there's another piece to be said there too. But yeah, I mean, I really think that when we're looking at parts work, what we have to experience and identify alongside our clients is the ways in which their needs were not met. Because all of us, regardless of how amazing and wonderful our parents were, had unmet needs. Regardless of how hard they tried, how hard they worked, there are always going to be some mismatches. And then you see in many situations where people were actually neglected or abused or invalidated or harmed. So looking at this, exploration around what were the needs that didn't get met for you. And then also looking at what capacity do I have now as an adult, internally, or what capacities can I identify in my safe relationships that can resource those younger parts? So when I have this need and I say okay, right now I'm having a really, really strong restriction urge and I need this validation. I need to feel safe. I need to feel like I'm doing the right thing. I can look and say this is a young need. This is a very young need. And in what ways can either I or people that I love, people that are safe for me, meet that need for validation, safety, stabilization? So I think it's really about looking internally at what an adult self has, what a more kind of grounded, centered self has access to, and what your safe attachment system now can offer you. So I think there's that component. And then, the aspect of the more macro systems, it's really hard for most of us to get resourced fully in ways that make us feel safe under these systems of oppression. And that's particularly true for folks who experience multiple levels of marginalization. So that's certainly a broader conversation to have. But yeah, I think it's looking at what we have access to and then creating what we can where we can and acknowledging that there are limitations on that.
Yeah, I think the understanding of the limitations, I think, is an important part too, about like what can I actually influence and then what can I only, and taking ownership of that. Like, okay, I can't fully change this. I'm doing things like the way that I show up in my voting and the things that I am fighting for and the way that I can go to a rally. I can go to things. I can talk about this stuff. I can be part of a community that is like-minded in that way and help reinforce my belief system so that I can then have more agency inside myself. Right.
Yeah.
And I think like that's an interesting thing to kind of think about is how do I notice that I might have these unmet needs? How do I even begin to see what systems I'm living in if I've just been trying to get by, and not sometimes you don't even realize that you have an eating disorder until one day it's like, oh, wow, like I have an eating disorder. I had no idea, because to us, it's like, oh, this is just how I've been living. And I'm really curious too of like when you're going down this path or if someone who's coming across this episode, how do we identify whether or not we have unmet needs and what does that look like? And also too, not shaming the people around us not shaming the people around us, but like, how do we create space for those unmet needs? And how do we identify them completely, even though we're living in the world that we're living in?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I feel like that is such a challenging question and something that I think, again, is messy, right? Like so much of this eating disorder healing work obviously is very, very messy. But I think helping folks sort of identify like, what makes them feel safe. I think oftentimes identifying what you don't have or the needs that are unmet starts with kind of examining how you feel when you are safe, when you are stable. So if I'm working with a client who's like, I've been engaging in these eating disorder behaviors for a really long time. I really don't know why. I really don't understand where they're coming from. But they make me feel, they make me feel grounded. They make me feel stable, safe. What we know ultimately is that those are ineffective strategies. They're not, because like you said, they're destructive. They're simultaneously harmful. But what I like folks to think about is like outside of the eating disorder, when you feel stable, strong, safe, grounded, what are the ingredients? Mm-hmm. What are the things that are happening? You're feeling supported by your loved ones. You're feeling excited about your professional or educational opportunities. You are feeling connected to the earth and to things that are important to you in nature, climate, whatever it might be. So I like to help folks think about like, this is how you feel when things are going well. Let's look at what your day to day is like, because these things are not always present. And helping them see like, okay, this is how the eating disorder is filling the gap right now. Thank goodness that the eating disorder is helping you get those needs met in a temporary way. But let's think about how can we bring in connection to the land? How can we bring in more sustainable, loving relationships? How can we bring in access to, vocational experiences that are exciting to you, whatever it might be? So I think sometimes identifying what you don't have and what you need starts with exploring how things look when you're feeling good.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's such a great way of kind of getting into it. And then you can also, it helps you open your eyes a little bit to where your eating disorder might be filling in gaps for you and on your day to day. And is my life structured to support more of these safe feelings versus unsafe feelings? And like, how do I restructure my life? How do I do that? And again, underneath the guise of what do I have access to? What can I actually pull in as support for that? And I think that's really interesting to kind of play around with. And I think what I really love about bringing parts work into eating disorder work is that it really provides an opportunity for someone to get to know themselves and to get to know their eating disorder without trying to squash it down and ignore it, because it has been there, like you said, as a really caring and thoughtful, like it was birthed out of something to protect you and to support you and to provide something to you. And when we think about it like something that's bad that needs to go away, we are also banishing all of the unmet needs.
Right.
Like we're squashing them down too, because they can't come up if we don't understand why this came about. And I think, so for a lot of people, I think sometimes that is really scary. Like when I talk to clients about that too, and I'll say, hey, there's no bad parts here. We're actually, what I want you to do is I want you to engage with your eating disorder. I want you to get to know it. I want you to understand, why is it here? What is it doing? What is it talking about? Why is it asking you to do these things, or why does it matter so much to them that we check this box and then we make sure we do these things? What is it providing you? What is the red herring over here that it's giving us? And I think that's the interesting thing, that a lot of times I think can be scary, because you're like, oh, well, no, that's a box. There's a box under there that we don't open that box without knowing. But that's when you do it with a trained professional who can help you with the proper resources and like going down that road together. And so I'd love for you to, as we kind of wrap up here a little bit I'd love for you to share a little bit about, if you feel like, and I think you do based off this conversation, is why do you feel that bringing in parts work is so important in ED healing, and how can people bring it in if they're already working with someone and they're already down this road and they want to start bringing this in a little bit more because they resonate with this conversation?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it is absolutely crucial to bring parts work into eating disorder healing, because we cannot treat somebody with compassion, care, love, attunement when we aren't understanding the incredibly sacred needs that the eating disorder is working so hard to meet. And I think it oftentimes helps to do that historical analysis of like, when did you learn that nobody around you could meet that need? When did you learn that your environment, your global system couldn't meet that need? Because at a certain point, you came to understand that your eating disorder was your best bet. And let's meet you in that moment. Let's meet you there and practice so much radical compassion for you, and be really gently curious about whether maybe that young part has any openness to things being different. Maybe that young part that didn't get its needs met, or an adult part that didn't get its needs met, needs to see it's crucial that they see that there are places that are safe. There are places where they can be loved, be valid, be free. So I think that meeting people where they're at really means seeing them fully and bearing witness to all the parts that are hurting, scary, stuck, unsure, things that maybe sometimes eating disorder professionals are uncomfortable with. We don't want to, work with somebody who is stuck or quote unquote non-compliant. But the reality is that if we meet people in helping them get resource, it's beautiful work. It's beautiful work that flows seamlessly from a place of real care. We just, as providers, have to be fearless in going there with our clients.
Oh, that is so true. I think I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I think there were some, if people want to read more about your thoughts on that, I know that you did some stuff on Instagram about providers and being scared of eating disorder treatment. And I know that you have resources for providers. So if you're a provider listening to this, please go to Jennie and see what she has available on her Instagram. And I'm sure, like you said, you have resources for practitioners too, because I think it is really important that you have to get down in the messy. It's messy in an eating disorder. It's really, it's really complex and really messy. And like you said, if we're going to meet our clients where they are, we have to get down in there with them and be supportive of that, and also bear witness to the journey that they're on, which can be a really beautiful journey, but it can also be really messy. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I think there definitely needs to be more practitioners willing to do it, because a lot of times people just get blown off. Like I've seen that happen with clients
Yeah.
of mine. Like, oh, I started opening up to my therapist about my eating disorder and now they don't see me anymore. Whoa, there's another one. Like even like another like step in the, okay, now I really can't talk about this.
Right.
You know, that
Right.
keeps it even more locked and secretive and everything like that. And it needs to be brought out. You know, we need to talk about it more openly. We need to get down in the dirt with them. And I love that you mentioned that. I appreciate that so much. And I appreciate you coming on and having this conversation. I also secretly want you to come back on and talk about attachment styles a little bit.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, Christina, I would love to. I love talking about attachment. It's seriously like I just could nerd out about it. And I also love talking about it in a way that's like accessible and feels real, not just like academic speak, but I would love to at any point.
Yeah, I think it's something that people don't like. We hear a lot, like we hear little nuggets about like, oh, what's my attachment style? I feel like it's like your new zodiac sign.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a lot of ways, it's like, oh, this is my attachment style. And I think it'd be really cool to talk about like what your attachment style might tell us about your relationship with food and your body and what can be bred from it. Could be really, really interesting. And I would love to have you on. So stay tuned for another podcast. But please let everyone know where they can find you, where like what you're up to and all of the things.
Yes. Totally. Yeah. So obviously having this conversation has been such a treat. And, I would love to connect with anybody who has listened to this episode, who has questions, who's looking for supervision or guidance. So in my private practice, I provide consultation and supervision to providers who are looking to grow in this way, who are looking to do either more parts-oriented work or more social justice-oriented work. I really enjoy doing that, guidance and gentle scaffolding for providers. My website is jwhrevolution.com. jwhrevolution.com. So on my website, you can figure out ways to contact me. I have lots of resources for providers who might want to learn more in this direction. My Instagram is at Dr. Jennie WH. And I do a lot of eating disorder education on that page and stuff. Yeah, just about these messy places that providers go to and like the ways we can be brave in doing it. I love those conversations. My private practice is, got lots of exciting things going on. We have a group called the Provider Solidarity Group. So if you are a provider who has an eating disorder, this space is for you to come be in community with other folks who are struggling or have struggled. So I'm really excited about that group, but yeah, just lots of cool clinical offerings going on, and really love connecting with folks. So if anybody has thoughts or questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much. It was wonderful having you on, and I'm really excited for our next conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Christina.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey friends, it's Dana, and thanks so much for listening to the Wholehearted Eating Podcast today. Find us on social media at Wholehearted Eating Pod on Instagram and at wholeheartedeating.com for more information about working with Dana and Christina for one-on-one nutrition counseling. If you love the show, we would love you forever if you'd share an episode with your family and friends, or tag us on social media, or leave a 5-star rating or review wherever you listen to podcasts to help more people find the show. Check out patreon.com/wholeheartedeating to help support the show and get access to ad-free episodes, bonus episodes with us and our guests, episode discussions, new resources we're creating for Patreon, and so much more. If you have questions for us, feedback on the show, potential topics or guests you'd love to have on, shoot us an email at hello@wholeheartedeating.com, and we'll see you next week.